Welcome everyone to a meeting of the Boston Region Metropolitan Planning Organization. I'm David Moeller, representing Secretary Jamie Tesler here. All participants will join the meeting with muted microphones. Please rename yourself to include your first name, last name, and affiliation if you have one. Please do not mute or unmute yourself. To participate in the discussion, please select the raise hand function. Find this by clicking either on the participants button at the bottom of the screen. Get some out of the way. And a window will pop up with a raise hand button at the bottom or the reactions button in the toolbar. The chair will then call on participants. If you're on the phone, you can use *9 to raise your hand. If you have any technical difficulties, please contact Rosine Foley via the chat box or at rfoley@ctps.org or call her at 857-702-3704. This meeting is accessible to people with disabilities. Zoom products are compliant with exceptions with the following standards: Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 Level AA standards and revised Section 508 standards. If you require any additional accommodations in order to participate fully in this meeting, please contact Rosine Foley of the MPO staff at rfoley@ctps.org or call her at 857-702-3704. Next item on the agenda is the introductions. As I said earlier, I'm David Moeller. I represent Secretary Jamie Tesler here. Jonathan, please call the roll.
Mass DOT C2.
John Bouchard, representing Highway Administrator Jonathan Gulliver.
Thank you. Mass DOT Highway Division.
John Romano here.
Thank you. MBTA.
Jillian Linnell, representing General Manager Steve Poktak.
Thank you. Massport. Okay. MAPC.
Good morning. This is Eric Barassa with the Metropolitan Area Planning Council.
Thank you. MBTA Advisory Board.
Good morning, Brian Kane, present.
Thank you. Regional Transportation Advisory Council.
Leonard Diggins, Advisory Council here.
City of Boston, Boston Transportation Department.
Bill Conroy from City of Boston, representing Mayor Kim Janey.
Thank you. City of Boston BPDA.
Hi, Jim Fitzgerald with BPDA, representing Mayor Janey, City of Boston.
Thank you. At-large City of Everett.
Jay Monty, representing Mayor DiMaria and the City of Everett.
Thank you. At-large City of Newton.
David Kozas, representing Mayor Ruth Ann Fuller in the City of Newton.
Thank you. At-large Town of Arlington.
J.D. Lamstutz, Town of Arlington, representing Select Board Chair Steve DeCourcy.
Thank you. At-large Town of Brookline.
Todd Corain, representing Select Board Chair Heather Hamilton and the Town of Brookline.
Thank you. Intercore Committee, City of Somerville.
Tom Bent, City of Somerville, representing Mayor Joe Curtatone in the Intercore.
Thank you. Minuteman Advisory Group on Interlocal Coordination, Town of Acton. Okay. Metro West Regional Collaborative, City of Framingham.
Thatcher Keyser, representing Mayor Spicer, Metro West.
Thank you. North Shore Task Force, City of Beverly.
Darlene Wynn, representing Mayor Michael Cahill for the North Shore Task Force.
Thank you. North Suburban Planning Council, City of Woburn.
Good morning, Tina Cassidy, representing Woburn Mayor Scott Galvin and the NSPC.
Thank you. South Shore Coalition, Town of Rockland.
Jen Constable, Town of Rockland for the South Shore Coalition.
Thank you. Southwest Advisory Planning Committee, Town of Medway. Okay, and Three Rivers Interlocal Council, Town of Norwood, Neponset River Regional Chamber.
Good morning, Tom O'Rourke from the Town of Norwood, representing the Trick subregion.
Okay, and our ex officio members, Federal Highway Administration.
Good morning, Ken Miller, Federal Highway.
Good morning, Cassie Ostrander, Federal Highway.
Thank you. And Federal Transit Administration. That calls the roll, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, John. Next item on the agenda is the chair's report. I don't have one today. Tegan, you're up next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm Tegan Tyke, Executive Director to the MPO staff. My apologies for not updating my name. I'm in the office today and I'm having some issues with reconnecting and getting my settings. So you may see me drop on and off after this trying to fix it. But first, let me give you my report. I have a few things to update everyone on. So first of all, just want to call out that the federal fiscal year actually ends next Thursday, and we will begin a new federal fiscal year after that. So we have, a variety of projects and efforts that we're working to wrap up within the end of the federal fiscal year. And we also have a number of recruitments that are coming up. As you know, a few of our staff recently left, some of them who've worked more closely with the board over the years, and we'll be recruiting to replace them among other positions as well. So just briefly, we have a job posting out now for project accountant, and we're looking and interviewing folks for that position. In addition, we will be soon hiring for a UPWP project manager and transportation planner, which may trigger some of you to wonder what is happening to our friend Sandy Johnston. And I am happy to say that it's actually a very positive thing. Sandy is looking to grow and move out of the UPWP manager position to pursue others of his transportation interests at CTPS. As I said, we're actually viewing this as a big opportunity for growth and to bring in somebody new to work on the UPWP while he is also present and able to train and make sure that they are very proficient at doing that job. The work he'll be moving on to will be leading the transit working group going forward. He will be working closely with Bill Kuttner to be trained and learn about the freight work that he does to take over that program when Bill Kuttner retires. And he's going to be involved in more studies that are going on that our staff does. So we look forward to helping him and watching him grow and succeed in this role. And I hope you will congratulate him on our endeavors. And again, we will be hiring for a UPWP project manager. So please, please, please send anyone you think would be good for that role our way. We hope to post next week. We also expect to post next week, we believe 2 positions actually to sort of to replace and expand on our public outreach capacity. So please keep an eye out for those. One of those positions is to replace Kate White's role, and we're looking to grow and increase our capacity beyond that role. And then we expect to have a few other positions coming soon after that. So that's what's going on with us right now. I wanted to provide you with a few comments, as I usually do, around public outreach and things that we are hearing from the public. First, we have 1 public comment to date on the MPO's public outreach plan, and that is out for review until October 6th. So there's still some time. The comment period was 45 days. But we are hoping to hear more from folks about their thoughts on this plan. And we will be holding a public information open house, excuse my sound there, from 5 to 6 this coming Monday. That's September 27th, if you or anyone you know would like to attend. We will also be holding the second this year virtual travel demand management or TDM forum on Thursday, September 30th from 4 to 5:30 p.m. If you haven't attended them before, they've been really interesting. This one will involve a panel of expert commentators, and they will discuss topics like thinking about TDM beyond the 9 to 5 commute, now that folks' commutes look very different, whether TDM is too focused on white collar commuters and not other types of commuters, and how regional planning agencies can help foster robust and equitable TDM policies. And then a third outreach activity I wanted to mention is the fall subregional outreach that our staff does each year, where we visit the MAPC subregions at fall meetings between October and December. And what we do when we visit them is we talk about TIP funding opportunities, UPWP study ideas, any other studies that are going on or maybe coming up that the subregional members might be interested in, available technical assistance, and we will also be talking about transportation needs for the long-range transportation plan. So please, if you are a part of any of those subregions, please help us spread the word and support those conversations as much as you can. Just to highlight the dates for you, we're expecting to be at Magic on Tuesday, October 5th, 2021. We expect to talk to the Inner Core Committee on Wednesday, October 13th. Trick on Tuesday, October 19th, and Swap at Tuesday, November 9th. And of course, you'll see more information coming out about those dates. Moving on to our agenda today and then our future agendas. Today, you're going to hear some recommendations from the TIP, Project Cost Ad Hoc Committee. Just as a reminder, for those of you who haven't participated in the committee, it was established temporarily as a temporary initiative to discuss and make recommendations on how the board will address project cost and schedule changes going forward in the TIP. So a very important conversation, and I think Matt Genova and Eric Barassa will be sharing what the committee's been discussing, their process, what consensus points they've reached themselves, and would like to share with you for your discussion. And if you feel ready, we will ask for your vote to release the new policies that you would like to adopt related to project cost and readiness changes. And we would submit that for public review and comment. And then finally, we have two other presentations today. One is about our plan to work with Mass DOT and other stakeholders and you as stakeholders in how we account for uncertainties related to the pandemic and post-pandemic travel behavior in our travel demand modeling. Obviously, this conversation is going on in many different forums. And this presentation and discussion with you today is about how we plan to talk with you about how to effectively incorporate into our travel demand model and modeling work. And then the second presentation is a follow-up to the MPO election survey that was presented on August 5th. And staff were asked to do a bit more digging into the data that we received from that survey. And we will present on that. And then just as a highlight for the next meeting coming up on October 7th, tentative agenda topics will include us presenting 3 of the studies conducted by MPO staff in this federal fiscal year. Again, that will be right after the close of the federal fiscal year. And that includes the Future of the Curb Phase 2, the Central Business District or CBD Phase 2, and also our broader outreach effort that is supposed to be supporting the LRTP scenario planning process, which was called Informing the Big Ideas Behind this Scenario Planning Process. So please look forward to those, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Tegan. Any questions for Tegan? Seeing none. Next item on the agenda is public comments. Are there any members of the public who would like to comment at this time? Seeing none, if you want to comment during the meeting, please raise your hand and we will call on you. Next item is committee chairs reports. Are there any? So the answer to that is no. Next up is the Regional Transportation Advisory Council report. Lynn?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It was a good meeting, but I really have nothing new to report out of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Next item is an action item to approve the minutes of August 5th. Can I get a motion in a second? And please state your name for the record when making the motion. Brian Kane.
Move acceptance, Mr. Chair.
Eric Barassa.
I will second that motion, Mr.
Thank you. Any comments, changes, questions, or suggestions? Seeing none, Jonathan, please call the roll.
David Moeller,
Yes.
John Bouchard,
John Bouchard, yes.
John Romano,
John Romano, yes.
Jillian Linnell,
Yes.
Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Brian Kane,
Brian Kane, yes.
Bill Conroy, okay, we'll come back.
Yes.
Oh, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozas,
David Kozas, yes.
Daniel Amstutz,
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Todd Corain,
Todd Corain, yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Bent, yes.
Thatcher Keyser,
Thatcher Keyser votes yes.
Darlene Nguyen,
Darlene Nguyen votes yes.
Tina Cassidy,
Tina Cassidy votes to abstain.
Jennifer Constable,
Jen Constable abstains.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Motion carries, Mr. Chair.
I'm sorry, Jonathan, I believe we missed the advisory council.
Oh, I'm terribly sorry. Leonard Diggins,
No problem. I'm used to being eclipsed by Mr. Kane.
Lynn, did you vote?
Yes.
Thank you, Lynn.
thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Next item on the agenda is the recommendations from the Transportation Improvement Program Project Ad Hoc Subcommittee. I don't know whether Eric or Matt is going first, but I'll let you guys take it away.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, and just for context, I'll run through the slides from sort of start to finish here, and then Eric will be here obviously for the dialogue at the end and can help add further context to these points. And then we'll go ahead and have a conversation at that time. So thank you. Okay, perfect. Thank you. So good morning, everyone. Thank you all for having me back. My presentation today will summarize the work of the TIP Project Cost Ad Hoc Committee. This committee met throughout this summer to discuss changes to MPO policies in response to recent TIP project cost increases. Today's presentation will discuss the policy recommendations that the committee has drafted in response to this issue, which we are looking for your feedback on today. So here's the ground that I'll cover in today's presentation. I'll begin by outlining our main goal for the conversation. I'll then take a little bit of time to talk about the overall process, followed by the TIP committee this summer. The heart of the presentation will be a discussion of the central problem areas identified by the committee, along with some recommended solutions to those challenges. I'll conclude with a handful of next steps before opening things up for a discussion and a possible vote. So beginning with our main goal for the day. Today, we'll discuss the draft policy recommendations that have been advanced by the TIP Policy Subcommittee. We'll focus on answering any questions on these proposed policies, and if the MPO is comfortable doing so, staff will ask that the board consider voting these proposed changes out for a public review period. Before diving into the heart of today's content, I want to spend a few minutes summarizing how the committee process unfolded this summer. The TIP Project Cost Change Ad Hoc Committee is both a mouthful, and it was formally established in April of this year in response to a second consecutive TIP funding cycle that was dominated by significant cost increases for projects the MPO has already committed to fund. The committee's charge was to evaluate the Boston MPO's existing project selection policies and recommend adjustments to these policies to mitigate cost increase issues in future TIP cycles. The committee is comprised of 9 members, including MAPC as the chair, state representation through the Highway Division, and broad regional representation through the Regional Transportation Advisory Council and the MBTA Advisory Board. There are also 5 municipal representatives on the committee, including Boston, Everett, Medway, Rockland, and Somerville. Though not formally members of the committee, meetings were also regularly attended by representatives from both the Federal Highway Administration and MassDOT's Office of Transportation Planning, both of whom helped to provide additional policy context during these discussions. The committee's work began on June 3rd, 2021, the same day that the final federal fiscal years 2022 through 26 TIP was endorsed by this board. At that meeting, committee members discussed their prospective scope of work and shared their goals for the overall committee process. The committee's second meeting in late June focused on developing a deeper understanding of the cost increase problem faced by the MPO over the last several years. Historical TIP data was analyzed, key takeaways from which we will discuss here on the coming slides. From there, the committee spent 4 more meetings in July, August, and early September, refining policy recommendations aimed at tackling the challenges illuminated through the committee's earlier data analyses. The committee voted at its September 2nd meeting to send their recommendations back to the full MPO board for your review, which brings us to our conversation today. During the committee's first couple of meetings, a handful of clear problem areas emerged around which the committee would later shape policy recommendations. These areas included, first, the high degree of cost uncertainty early in project design. In other words, the earlier in the design process a project is added to the TIP, the greater the likelihood its final cost will be significantly higher than its originally projected cost. Second, the lack of a clear process for the MPO to handle cost increases when they do happen. Third, the limited amount of engagement between many project proponents and the MPO board and staff, other than that which is absolutely necessary for developing the new TIP. And fourth, the lack of clarity around the MPO's expectations for project proponents after their projects are originally selected for funding in the TIP. Beyond just stating these broad areas for potential intervention, I also want to highlight some of the specific data reviewed by the committee as they crafted their recommendations. Up front, it was clear that the committee needed to develop an understanding of the true scale of the project cost change problem. In order to do that, MPO staff pulled 10 years of project data, which included a sample of 50 projects that have been funded using the MPO's regional target funds. At this point, I'd like to give a quick shout out to my colleague, Matt Archer, who helped pull together a lot of the data used in these analyses. His help was really invaluable in making this work happen over the summer. To get an understanding of the problem, staff broke out the cost increases for each project by design stage. As you can see on the slide, the average MPO funded project increased in cost by 42% when advancing from its original approval by MassDOT's Project Review Committee, which is in many ways the first formal step in the TIP process, to a 25% design submission. Costs went up further as projects advanced to 75% and 100% design, though the magnitude of increase was less with each successive step in the design process. For that reason, the committee focused in on this 25% design step in its policy recommendations, a topic that we will come back to here in just a few minutes. Overall, the average TIP project increased in cost by 60% from PRC approval to 100% design, with the median project increasing more than 40%. You'll notice here that all of the averages are higher than the medians. This dynamic is driven by a handful of outlier projects that saw their costs increase by well over 100% during their lifetimes in the TIP. Thought about a different way, the committee also looked at just those projects that had made it to 100% design, of which there were 23 projects in our sample. We broke out their total cost increases during their TIP life cycles by the design stage at which each project was first programmed, yielding the results you see on the slide here. As you can see, those projects that were originally selected for funding at PRC approval had an average total cost increase of nearly 95%, and a median cost increase of more than 70%. Notably, those projects were originally selected for funding at 25% design, saw only roughly a 25% cost increase during their lifetime in the TIP. And those projects that were first selected for funding at 75% design saw virtually no cost change at all, advancing to 100% design. We also wanted to get a sense of, for the overall distribution of cost changes by scale. Going back to our full sample here, you can see that a majority of the projects funded by the MPO over the last decade have seen their costs increase by 40% or more during their time in the TIP. As shown by this graph, along with the median values that I just presented on the previous slides, the cost increase problem isn't just being driven by a few high increase outliers, but is rather a fairly systemic problem across all projects. I'll note here that we did this analysis also broken out by project type, that is separated out cost increases for bicycle and pedestrian projects, complete streets projects, etc., and saw that all project types experienced sizable cost increases. We also did have a handful of projects with cost decreases, as you see on the left-hand side of this chart here, though those are unfortunately clearly the exception rather than the rule over the last decade. One other question that was explored by the committee was whether or not the scale of any given cost increase could be explained by the length of time a project took to make it through the development and design process. Here you see a plot of the 23 projects in our sample that have reached 100% design. The median TIP project took 6.5 years or 78 months to go from PRC approval to this milestone. While there are some projects that took much longer than this, most notably 2 projects in our sample that took more than 20 years or 240 plus months to reach 100% design, these long timelines were not good predictors of large cost increases. As you can see by the very shallow slope of the line on the chart here on the slide, and its accompanying R-squared value of 0.01, there's not a strong relationship between project timeline and cost increase, at least in our sample of 23 projects that have made it through to 100% design. And for reference, an R-squared value of 0.01 means that only roughly 1% of the change in project cost can be explained by a change in the project timeline. So again, just reinforcing the notion that project timeline itself is not a good predictor of project cost increases. So the last data points that I'll share are those related to current project status by programming year in the TIP. As I noted at the outset of this section, the Boston MPO has historically not set clear expectations for project proponents once their project has been programmed in the TIP. This includes setting expectations around how quickly projects should advance through design once they've been selected for funding. We looked at some of our peer MPOs around the Commonwealth and took note of the project development benchmarks that have been established by the Cape Cod Commission. Cape Cod issues guidance to proponents at the time of programming that states how far along in design their project should be with each passing TIP cycle in order to stay on track for advertisement. For example, projects in the second year of the 5-year TIP should be approaching 100% design, while projects in the third year of the TIP should be approaching 75% design. As you can see in the chart here, a vast majority of the projects in the first 2 years of the Boston MPO's forthcoming 2022 through 26 TIP are still at 25% design. This is especially concerning for projects in year 1 of the TIP, again, those projects in 2022, which are all supposed to be advertised for construction bids in the next 12 months. So of the 33 projects in the fiscal years 22 through 26 TIP, 70% of them would not meet the project development benchmarks set forth by the Cape Cod Commission. So some key takeaways from all of this include the following. 1, the cost increase problem is pervasive across project types and project development timelines. 2, the largest project cost increases tend to occur between when projects are approved by MassDOT's Project Review Committee and when they reach 25% design. 3rd, there's not a strong relationship between overall project timeline and the magnitude of a project's cost increase. And 4th, MPO monitoring of projects, and therefore the design progress that is made by those projects, tends to be fairly limited until project advertisement deadlines start to approach. This leads to recurring scenarios where projects are delayed until later years due to lagging behind schedule. So from those takeaways flow 3 core policy recommendations. 3 central ideas really emerged from the committee's conversations as key components of a revised set of TIP programming policies. First, the MPO's new TIP programming policy should require that projects reach a more advanced design status prior to project programming. Second, new touchpoints should be created between all TIP stakeholders to ensure clear, timely, and proactive communication around project progress, deadlines, and challenges. And third, a new set of policies should include the establishment of a process for rescoring projects when they see cost changes beyond a specified threshold. So I'll move through each of these ideas on the following slides. I'll also note that there is a memo posted to the MPO meeting calendar that outlines each of these elements in more detail. So I'd encourage everyone to have that available for reference as we move through today's conversation. Beginning with the recommendation to consider changing the required design status of a project at programming, this proposal sets a higher threshold for project programming than what is currently required by the MPO. Right now, the MPO only requires that projects be approved by MassDOT's Project Review Committee prior to having funding allocated in the TIP. The recommendation here is to raise this threshold to require that proponents have submitted 25% design plans and have received an updated cost estimate from MassDOT based on this submission. This policy change would be accompanied by 3 other complementary changes that are designed to create the greatest chances of success for all parties. First, the MPO should formalize a preliminary project evaluation step to allow proponents to have their projects scored by MPO staff prior to advancing to 25% design. This would provide proponents guidance on how likely their project is to receive MPO funding before significant local funding is invested in design. Projects could be scored anytime after PRC approval, and these scores could be shared with the MPO so that the board has an understanding of the projects in the pipeline for funding in the near future. I'll note here that this would mirror the MPO's current practice of scoring these projects and sharing those scores with the board, though the only change would be that those projects that have not yet reached 25% submission would just not be eligible for selection for funding. Second, the MPO should establish year-by-year project development benchmarks to set clear expectations for proponents from the time of TIP programming until their projects are advertised for construction bids. These benchmarks could be similar to those created by Cape Cod Commission and could likewise be used as an opportunity to check in with proponents throughout the project development process. And finally, MPO staff should create additional supporting materials to help proponents understand the TIP process and move through it smoothly. Such a how-to guide could include things like project development benchmarks that I just mentioned, as well as links to MassDOT resources that help facilitate the 25% design submission and other critical steps. So some of the key reasons for selecting 25% submission as a threshold for TIP programming include the following. First, the 25% design submission is the first time that a project receives a full engineering review from MassDOT staff. This means that MassDOT staff are closely inspecting every aspect of a project and generating a revised cost estimate based on those specifics. This stands in contrast to the cost estimate that a project receives at PRC approval, which is based more generally on the project's broad scope of work. By waiting until the full 25% design plans are submitted, the MPO can have a greater degree of confidence in the cost estimate before committing funding to a project. Second, the transition from PRC approval to 25% design is where we've historically seen the largest cost increases in TIP projects. Requiring 25% design submission is arguably the most important intervention in significantly reducing the scale of the current cost increase problem faced by the MPO. And third, project proponents are familiar with the 25% design submission as a key step in the TIP process. Setting a less familiar threshold, such as MassDOT's recently created pre-25% design review, may make this policy change a little bit more confusing and would result in the MPO relying on a step in the design process for which there is little data to assess past efficacy. So the committee's second recommendation is to increase TIP stakeholder communications, which is a multifaceted policy proposal. Changes to these communications would involve establishing biannual check-ins between MPO staff, project proponents, and MassDOT staff on project status over and above regular communications. Encouraging project proponents to include MPO staff on any design submissions to MassDOT, and requiring that project proponents present to the MPO when there are major cost or scope changes to their projects. This recommendation is critical for 3 key reasons. First, this updated policy provides the MPO board with more complete and timely information with which to make decisions. Second, this new policy supports an environment where proactive conversations can happen around project issues before they balloon into significant cost increases or schedule delays. This aligns well with the proposed 25% design programming threshold, the policy that I just discussed, as both of these policies really seek to limit the number of cost increases seen by the MPO in the first place. And third, this policy would help foster greater proponent accountability for their project, especially as it relates to cost and schedule. And finally, the committee's third recommendation is to establish a clear and consistent policy for rescoring projects when costs change beyond a specified threshold. This proposal involves a multi-step process that proponents would move through in the event of a cost increase. The proposal is to establish a threshold for triggering this process of $2.5 million for projects over $10 million, or 25% of project costs for those projects under $10 million. This number was chosen because 25% is the average cost increase to 100% design for a project that was originally programmed by the MPO at 25% design over the last 10 years. So if we move to that new 25% design threshold, this would sort of line up with those historic numbers. And so exceeding that threshold for a cost increase in any given year would trigger step 2. As a quick aside, I know that this board has discussed Virginia's Smart Scale program on and off over the last couple of years. So Virginia uses a threshold of 10 to 20% of project cost increase, depending on the overall project cost. And that makes the proposed threshold here roughly in line with peer funding agencies, though ours proposed here is even a little bit on the generous side. If proponents exceed this threshold, they would be required to attend an MPO meeting to explain the cause of the cost increase to the board. If the cost change is a result of an updated project scope, proponents may request that their project score be updated to reflect the new changes. The new cost and score would then be plotted on a 4-quadrant matrix, similar to what's used by the Atlanta Region Transit Link Authority. This is a model that's also been discussed by this board in the past. Because it's been a while since we've talked about that model, here is a quick refresher on what that looks like. So in this model, project score is plotted against cost per point, with projects divided into tiers by relative values on these metrics. This helps to establish baseline cost effectiveness values for each project. Tier 1 projects are those that are high score and low cost per point, or the top left-hand segment of this quadrant here. Those tier 1 projects would be considered the most cost effective relative to their peers in this matrix. Tier 2 projects are low score, low cost per point, or high score, high cost per point. And then finally, tier 3 projects are low score, high cost per point, or the least cost effective projects relative to their peers in the TIP. So in using a system like this, tier 1 projects would be the first priority for funding, followed by tier 2 and then tier 3. A little bit more explanation here. So in a hypothetical TIP programming scenario, we may have a couple of complete streets projects, let's say, with cost increases that meet the threshold for further investigation. One shown here had a cost increase, but didn't have a change in score. The project was a tier 2 project to begin with and remained so after its cost increase. Another project shown here has started as a tier 1 project, but moved into tier 2 due to a significant cost increase. You can also see that this hypothetical project went up in score, as the cost increase was due to changes that improve the project's performance using the MPO's TIP scoring criteria. The point of using a system like this is that it allows the MPO to understand the relative value of projects. This can help with when decisions need to be made about which projects to delay into later fiscal years, or which other projects to move up into earlier fiscal years in the event that costs increase or new funding becomes available. So in addition to assessing the cost and score of projects with increases, the proposed process would follow regular MPO practice, where board members would take into account a host of other information in deciding how to handle cost increase issues. The board would likely want to consider the cost, score, and readiness of other program projects, the availability of funds across fiscal years, whether or not projects with cost increases have had prior cost or readiness issues, and the distribution of MPO funds across investment programs, among other information. So this makes this 4-quadrant system just one of a number of tools that the MPO would have in its toolbox to interpret cost increases and assess possible paths forward. From there, the board would then need to make a decision on each project. The board may elect to fund the cost increase in full in the project's current fiscal year. The board may elect to fund the cost increase, but delay the project to a later fiscal year. The board may choose to not fund the cost increase with the requirement that the proponent seek additional funding from another source, or find a way to value engineer the project to reduce its cost. And finally, the MPO may also elect to remove the project from the TIP entirely. As noted on the last slide, the goal here is to allow the MPO to have a framework for addressing cost increases, but to do so in a way that still allows latitude for board discretion on each project. This recognizes that each project can have its own unique set of circumstances, and the board should be in a position to consider those when making decisions on project funding. Some final thoughts here on this process are that proponents should be given an opportunity to provide written or oral comments to the MPO in response to any decisions on project status that are made by the board. This reinforces the notion that the TIP process is one that is collaborative across all stakeholders, and that any changes made to a project's funding or status should be done in conversation with the board and proponents. This process would play out whenever decisions need to be made about project funding. So this could be during the normal TIP development process each spring, but could also occur if an amendment is needed to the existing TIP. And finally, the MPO should reserve the right to suspend this process in the event that exceptional circumstances arise. Such circumstances could include a sudden influx of new funding or a shift in MPO funding priorities. There are at least 3 reasons to pursue this third and final policy recommendation. First is that this policy would support the MPO in making decisions by providing the board with complete and timely information to understand project cost and scope changes. Historically, getting this information has occasionally been a challenge, and so building out a formal process for having proponents communicate directly with the board will help close that gap. Second, this policy helps to provide the MPO with a framework to think through cost increases while avoiding setting any hard and fast rules that limit the MPO's ability to exercise its discretion on each project's unique circumstances. This system allows the board to consider a range of qualitative and quantitative data to make informed decisions. And finally, this policy gives proponents a clear sense of how the MPO will consider their project in the event of a cost increase. Because no such system has been implemented to date, the board has expressed a concern that decisions on project cost and status may feel arbitrary or unfair. This policy sets a clear threshold for board action and establishes clear requirements for proponent engagement in negotiating any needed changes. And I guess fourth, one other benefit that I actually don't have listed on the slide, but I'll add into the conversation is that this third and final policy would also help address some of the MPO's long-running interest in doing more to establish baseline cost effectiveness scoring for projects. I know it's been sort of a long-running topic of conversation, and this would take us a step in that direction to having more cost effectiveness considerations built into the TIP process. So in closing, I want to highlight some final miscellaneous recommendations on 4 other topics that were discussed by the committee this summer. Similar to my last point here, the MPO should also consider introducing other cost effectiveness metrics, such as cost per mile or cost per user, in annual TIP programming conversations to better define project value in ways that help the MPO make decisions. So these don't have to be decided today, but this is sort of just a suggestion that the MPO may want to consider requesting this information from staff during TIP project programming, again, to help better understand project cost effectiveness when making decisions. Second, on the subject of the MPO's current 4% annual inflation rate, the recommendation is to leave this inflation rate as is for now, with the option to reassess later if necessary. And again, that 4% inflation rate is used by the MPO, but is also used as standard practice by MassDOT in programming TIPs across the entire state. Third, staff's recommendation is to also continue the MPO's historical practice of allocating all available TIP funding in each federal fiscal year. So for both of these last 2 recommendations, these sort of middle 2 on the slide here, the recommendations are based on the assumption that the first 2 policy areas that we discussed today, that is the proposal to program projects at 25% design and to increase proponent engagement, will work to limit the number of cost increases that the MPO actually sees in the TIP. So these policy changes should reduce the need to create extra financial flexibility in the TIP to cover cost increases. And so the proposal here is to wait and see how those policies work before moving to create more room for cost increases in each fiscal year. And finally here, the recommendation is to go ahead and implement all of these policy changes for the forthcoming TIP cycle, assuming that the board is ready to do so. So rolling out these changes simultaneously will help to establish a common baseline of expectations for all stakeholders. And of course, the MPO always has the option to adjust the implementation timeline of any new policies as needs change in the coming months. So before we dive into a discussion on these recommendations, I want to briefly touch on where we're heading from here. So with the approval of the board, the committee's recommendations would be released for public review in the coming days. Of course, if this board does not yet feel comfortable with releasing these recommendations, further changes could be made before this action is taken. Believe it or not, we are on the cusp, as Tegan noted in her executive director's report earlier today, we are on the cusp of the start of federal fiscal year 2022, and thus the start of the fiscal years 2023 through 27 tip cycle. Any further action on these policy recommendations should be taken with that in mind, as we'll want to finalize any policy changes before getting too far into the new tip cycle. And of course, before any policies are made final, this board will have a chance to review all public comments and make further adjustments. That final product will then be communicated back out to project proponents across the region. So with that, I'll turn things back over to the chair to open it up for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Questions, comments, discussion? Eric, do you want to go first and start us off?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just because I chaired the committee, I just want to add just one kind of last kind of framing on this. You know, I think the key thing here is that this is not some radical, change. I think in many ways we're kind of firming up what really our kind of expectations are about the process. And none of this is like a hard set in stone, black and white kind of if you don't do this thing, you're in or you're out. I think we're saying we want to see projects closer to 25% design before we program them on the tip. I think that in practice, we'll still probably program projects in the tip that might not fully be at that, especially in the near term, because there might not be enough projects that are at that level. But I think as we move forward, we want to see projects closer to that level. So just being clear about those expectations. I think the second recommendation about sort of more check-ins is really a good thing, and encouraging proponents and the district offices and in coordination with staff. And then finally, I think just establishing a process for how we objectively evaluate or reevaluate projects when they go up in cost. The alternative is that we just subjectively make decisions on whether to push projects off, but there's not kind of a clear reason for it or a rationale or a reevaluation. So I think it's this is an attempt to try to clarify what our kind of policies and procedures are, but they're not set in stone. And it's really kind of a guidance. And then finally, I just want to say, I want to thank Matt and the CTPS staff for doing a really great job. We met 4 or 5 times over the course of the summer. The committee also, for all the members for their time. There's a lot of robust discussion about this. And I think finally, we really do want to do a public comment, because not only do we want to make sure that our member municipalities are aware of this, but we do legitimately want to hear from folks and see if any of this is too difficult, or what people's thoughts are about it. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Eric. Jay Monty.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And first, I just want to thank Eric for chairing the committee, and Matt and the CTPS team for all their hard work in helping us with get to this point. It's really good discussions. Just speaking to each of the recommendations on a personal, or at least that represents Everett. I think the 25% policy, not programming a project till 25%. I personally, and being somebody who's been involved in project design and development for 15 years or so, this is the single biggest thing I think that will impact cost overruns. I think this, more than any other of the 2 policies, really is going to have a huge effect on getting our budget a little more under control. I think there are some concerns. Obviously, there's a significant amount of resources that it takes to get a project to 25%, and I don't want to be naive about that. I think there are going to be communities that will be affected by that. We really ought to think about what we do for those communities. And I think it's not the ones that we might assume. I think the assumption is that the environmental justice communities like Everett and Chelsea, that those will be the ones most impacted. I would disagree. I think actually it's going to be the smaller towns in our exurbs and far suburbs that will be the most affected by that policy. But that's just something we ought to think about as we move that forward. But nonetheless, I do agree that delaying the decision to program is the single biggest thing that will affect cost overruns. I think the second recommendation it's good policy. It's always good to communicate and keep everybody appraised of what the issues are, and so we all have a heads up. I don't know that alone will affect cost in a meaningful way, but I think it's still good policy. I do have some concerns with the third one, and I think my biggest one with the third recommendation is that we're implying that if a project goes over budget, that we would rescore it and reevaluate the cost benefit of that project. The issue here is that the scores today don't have a cost benefit analysis to them. So I don't know how you would take a project that say got an 80 in its first score, the cost goes up by 50%, you rescore it, presumably it's still going to be 80 because you had nothing in the scoring system that's going to, affect, or nothing in the scoring system where the cost will affect the score. So I guess I'm a little lost as to how that would really meaningfully impact, any decisions going forward. But that said, I do believe we probably should put something into our scoring system that does reflect some sort of cost benefit. I know that's part of some of the other recommendations. So I'll leave it there and let some other folks comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Jake. Daniel Amstutz.
Thank you very much. I definitely commend Matt and the committee. I wasn't able to attend the committee meetings, but I think they did. Matt gave a great presentation, and I really appreciate all the work that they've done. I think these are some great recommendations to think about. I'd just like to ask a few clarifying questions and then make just add a follow-up to it. But so the project, just so I understand, so the idea is that the project would be could be scored at PRC or preliminarily, I suppose, and then it would be rescored again once it actually gets to 25% to once it gets to 25% before it actually gets on the tip. Is that right?
Matt, you want to answer the questions as Daniel asked them?
Sure. Yeah, I can provide a quick answer to that. Yeah, the short answer is yes. So basically, we would continue the current practice that we have now of as soon as a project is PRC approved, it would be eligible for MPO scoring, and then as long as if it hasn't yet reached the 25% threshold, staff would continue to score that project annually, just like we do now. As long as it's not programmed, then as soon as it hits that 25% threshold, if it needs to be rescored, would continue to do that, but then the project would sort of jump into the eligible pool for programming. If that makes sense.
Okay, cool. The next thing is that this 25% design status sort of benchmark, is that like pretty common? Like I assume looking at other MPOs, whether in the state or around the region or country, like do they also use 25% design status as a typical, like you get on the tip type of benchmark?
So we did see, in looking at some of the work that Cape Cod Commission does, I mean, they do encourage projects to be closer to 25% design in that first year of programming. It's not a hard threshold, but, I think that's sort of what they're ideally shooting for as well. And so, this is really sort of, staff admittedly spent less time sort of looking around the country at that threshold specifically, and more based it on just, what we've seen with our projects here in the region over the last decade or so, and said, what do we think fits with what we're seeing on the ground here?
Okay, cool, thanks. So I'll just ask or go to my last things and then go to somebody else. But so the two things that came to mind, a couple of things that came to mind, also kind of as questions. But when it comes to the, I guess, recommendation 2, where it comes to sort of monitoring the projects over a course of time, I'm curious as to, it seems like additional staff work, or whether there is like a staffing capacity impact to additional coordination and communications. I mean, I think it seems very, very important that this gets done right. And perhaps the sort of flip side, or maybe you have to do less work sort of in the future if you're having these ongoing coordination meetings, right? So it's kind of like a wash in a way, but I'm curious how that has been thought about with regards to these recommendations. And then just the last thing is, some of the recommendations seem to be like, if there's a project that has this cost increase and it's come back to the board and they have to come back and explain it. I wonder if the committee talked about anything like some kind of project subcommittee that would maybe meet regularly to look at these things so they can perhaps be vetted before they come to the full MPO. I'm just sort of thinking of that, when we get into tip conversations, we get into sort of such minutia at the board meetings. I wondered if there's been like a better process to bring, have it vetted a little bit by a subcommittee before it comes to the board, so that there's maybe we spend less time sort of going over again the sort of minutia of specific projects. But I was just curious about that, so I'll leave it there and end my question. Thanks.
Thanks, Dan. Brian Kane.
Thank you, David. I just wanted to echo the thanks to Matt Archer and Matt Genova and Eric for everything they did to move us to this point. I think I'm kind of the guilty party responsible for calling for the creation of this committee, and it's all on me. But these guys did all the hard work, and I especially want to call out the work of John Bouchard. John Bouchard really educated me, and I think the whole committee, about how the MassDOT process works and how the hard work that they and the districts do with all of the project proponents to not only engineer but make sure that costs are included, and how they're trying to work with cost estimators out in the field to make sure that their costs are more real. So thank you, John, and everyone on your team. So I think it's important that we advance this and try it, at least put it out for public comment. It's entirely possible that we may have overlooked something, but I think the public comment period will help us figure that out. I also think that long-term, this is going to be a benefit for all of the communities in this region, because if we can get the cost estimates closer at the beginning, it will give us more flexibility as we move along in the process to get more projects in the tip. And ultimately, for me, it's about spreading the diversity of geography around and the dollars around the entire region. So I think this is ultimately a long-term positive that will benefit the entire region. And I just suggest that we try it and see what we hear back. Thanks.
Thanks, Brian. Lynn Diggins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And once again, I echo the thanks to staff, especially the questions that they provided in the process. Those questions were very helpful in helping us frame the issue, and all of my colleagues in the subcommittee were just really wonderful to work with. And the great part about this board is that it could have been any other subset of us, and I'm sure I would have felt the same way. I really like Dan's idea about the subcommittee for the project review when we have to deal with potential cost increases. I think my concern is that we have our meetings are long enough as it is. Not that I'm complaining, but I think it really would be good to have that subcommittee, because a lot of times I find towards the end of our meetings, I in particular am hesitant to ask questions, because it's like 2 hours and who really wants to stay for 3 hours. So I like that idea a lot. With respect to Jay's comment, I do agree about the effect of the 25% on smaller communities rather than what the groups that or the communities that we would maybe initially think would be affected. So it would be wise, I think, or good for us to think about that impact and how to mitigate it. With respect to Jay's other comment, though, about the cost-benefit analysis, on some level, I think most of us are doing that already when we look at the scores and we compare the cost of the project to the scores. And I think what we are proposing here is formalizing that a bit more. And I support Brian in getting this out sooner rather than later, because I think it is important to hear from the public. And one comment that we got in the last RTAC meeting was concerns about what would happen with projects that are already programmed. And that kind of fits in what Jay was saying, but I think we might hear more of that. And finally, we have this 4% inflation rate. And I wanted to ask either you, Mr. Chair, or anyone else from MassDOT, because I understand that we want to be consistent with the rest of the state. But I just feel that that should be compounded because what it does, especially when things go out longer, is that it penalizes lower cost projects and lets higher cost projects be, well, it doesn't account for their potential cost increases in the way that the real world functions. I just want to understand why it is that MassDOT does it that way. And I think discussing whether or not to change that is something that can happen during the public comment period. Thank you.
You're welcome. And actually, Lynn, I don't know that that's a MassDOT requirement. If the MPO wants to have a 4% compounded inflation rate, I think the MPO is certainly allowed to. You can't have less than 4%, and you can't have less than 4% uncompounded. But I don't necessarily think that's a MassDOT decision.
Right, but I was just trying to, but I think it's for consistency with the rest of the state. And so I can understand our desire not to be different than the rest of the states. I just wanted to understand the rationale behind MassDOT for doing non-compounded.
Well, again, it's not our decision to be non-compounded. It's most of the MPOs don't compound, and we would recommend consistency. But if the Boston MPO decides to compound the inflation, we can work with that. It's just a spreadsheet.
All right, thank you.
Yep.
Mr. Chair,
Mr.
Can Matt and I address the rescoring question that's come up a little bit?
Sure.
So I think Jay asked this question and I think someone else. So I think what Matt Genova has proposed is that all projects, when they are going through the TIP development process, they would be plotted on a chart where we would show their cost and in relationship to their score. So we would see all of that. And then when projects change, if they go up in cost, they would be replotted, and we would be able to see, does a project, how do they move? Do the high scoring, low cost projects, does that change? Does a high scoring, low cost project become now does a low cost, high scoring project become a high cost, high scoring project, or does it become a high cost, low scoring project? And so, Matt, I don't know if you have that slide, but that might address Jay's question about how the rescoring would take place.
Could you go back? Yeah, back to the sort of 4-quadrant. There we go. Thank you. Yeah, definitely happy to take further questions on this. I know this is one of the more nuanced elements of this proposal. But yeah, like Eric is getting at here, I mean, it's really just to understand sort of relative value across projects, because I think one of the themes that especially came out of TIP discussions this past spring was that often we're thinking about handling project cost increases with just this project, that project, sort of project X, project Y, what have you. But really, it's a decision about all of the projects in the TIP as a collective and how we prioritize funds across all of them. And so I think having something like this that helps put a little bit more meat on the bone, so to speak, of understanding relative value, rather than just having a score number and a cost number, we can sort of have something that's sort of one step further in analysis as a decision-making tool. And then again, to reiterate Eric's points at the start of this discussion, I mean, this is really just a tool in the toolbox. There isn't a hard sort of cutoff here of, a project has gone from tier 1 to tier 2 and now it's out of the TIP, nothing like that. I mean, this is really just helping to provide a little bit further information to make those prioritization decisions, which is really sort of ultimately what moving projects around in the TIP is. Thanks.
But the point is that all projects would be scored according to this matrix here, and then they would be rescored when projects go up in cost. So there would be a comparison.
Right, but so I hope not to talk about this chart. I don't understand. No, it's okay. I don't understand, mainly because I'm not sure I support it, but I support this whole concept of getting this out and discussing it in public. I'm just not clear, like, how we divided between tiers 1, 2, and 3. I mean, I understand obviously on the plot, how things, it's just a cost per point. But how and why did we decide that things that are above 50 points and less than $150,000 per point are tier 1, and things that are less than 50 but below 150,000 but higher than 50 and higher than 100? Like, I don't understand that part of that, because it's just, most of this is just a simple spreadsheet, right? I can do the math. I can figure out for myself what the cost per point is of the project before its cost increase, and what the cost per point for the project is after its cost increase. It's just math. It's easy. I don't understand the graphic representation of it, or why, as policy makers, we should agree that that small box is actually what is tier 1. And if you're in there, you're definitely a great project. And what's in tier 3 is probably, you better hope your costs don't go up anymore, or you don't lose points. Like, I don't understand any of that.
Yeah, so I think that those details, the group, like, we can decide on what those thresholds are. I think it's just, this is just an illustration of the methodology. So we can have a further discussion on, is it really 45 points or, whatever that, this is just an illustration of the methodology.
Okay.
Yeah. And I guess just to answer the question about sort of how these were determined for this test here, is that the median values for both evaluation score and cost per point for this sample were used as the sort of cutoffs on the XY axis here. And so, yeah, so if median value isn't the sort of correct measure to draw a distinction between different projects, like Eric said, we can certainly discuss that further. But that's just what we went with for illustrative purposes.
Excellent. And then again, I'm not saying it shouldn't be. I just didn't realize that's what it was. Thanks, Matt. Tom Bent.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, I wanted to thank Eric and Matt and the rest of our committee members for this project. And it was funny. I was going to bring up what Eric just brought up, so I'm not going to bring it up again. But one of the things, though, that Eric said earlier about how these recommendations aren't like, hey, we're just going to implement everything overnight. This would be over a period of time, phase them in. Obviously, projects that are already in the process, we're not going to upend them. And then kind of see how this plays out. But one of the things that I said at the last committee meeting was that what I really wanted to hear from was, and today hopefully we're part of that, is from the rest of the MPO members and ultimately the public, so that we can fine tune some of these recommendations. So I'd be advocating to vote this out today for public comment, but then continue the discussion among ourselves to get, to have a chance for everyone to kind of vet this and kind of go through it and absorb what we have, and then come back and, have more discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. But Eric, can I ask a question about something Tom just said? Or
yeah.
The proposal is that this will apply immediately to 2023 projects, right? That if this is adopted, the cost threshold of, we want to reconsider what to do about your project because it's increased by a certain cost or percentage, applies to 23 projects, right?
Yeah. So
Did I misunderstand?
we're not, if there are projects that are on the tip today that are not at the 25% submittal, we're not kicking them off the tip and making them wait. They're on the tip already if we've already programmed them. If a project, like you said, David, is programmed in 23 or 24, and during the next cycle, we hear it, they come back and say it's gone up in cost, we will use this framework to reevaluate it so that it will help inform how we right size the tip, whether which projects we push out to later years, et cetera, et cetera. So we aren't going to take anybody off the tip if they're not at the 25%. That is the point I think Tom was getting at.
Got it. Thank you, Eric, for clarifying. David Kozis.
Thank you. I also really wanted to thank everybody who worked on this committee. They mostly seem to be reasonable and important recommendations, and I also think it should go up for public comment. I had one question about the 25% design, and maybe this was in one of the slides in the presentation, but do we know again, how many projects, maybe over the past couple of years, were programmed, that we did program on the tip prior to getting to the 25%. I'm just wanting to understand if it's a large number of projects that would be affected or just a few. And also, I'm not sure if we're referring to the 25% submittal or the 25% approval. And I'm not even really sure what the average time lag is typically between a project getting submitted and approved. But I think we're saying that the project needs to be 25% approved before it would be considered, no, just submitted.
We're talking about the submittal because there can be a year or more between the submittal and the public hearing and the approval. So it's the submittal. And Matt might be looking for the data right now, but I think it's the majority of projects that we have approved over the past 5 or 6 years that were pre 25% submittal.
Okay. Do we know if there's typically a cost change between a 25% submittal and a 25% approval?
Yes, so we had a very robust discussion. Again, John Romano, John Bouchard were incredibly helpful in this, in what's the difference between the amount of kind of input that occurs at PRC versus the 25% submittal and the amount of work that goes into that. And there is a cost update, a formal cost update that occurs at that point.
Okay, so I think we would just need to think about how that would, how that would be covered in this process if there's a 25%, cost increase between the, the submittal and the.
Correct. We discussed that, and the consensus was that the formal approval was that the change between the submittal and the formal approval are much smaller than between PRC and the 25% submittal, and that the 25% approval can be another year or more, and that was a higher bar than the group was willing to go with.
I see. Okay, and also I'm just again wondering if we did have all these policies in place, how many projects are we actually talking about that we would have, over the past couple of years that we did program after 25%, and then also had a 25% cost increase. I don't know if it's just a handful of projects or, that would just be interesting to know. But again, I still think we should just send this out for public comment for sure.
Your question is, what was the average cost change between 25% submittal and 25% approval?
Well, that's one of the questions. Yeah.
Okay. I think Matt is looking at, he might be trying to bring up all the projects that we programmed that were pre 25%, but in his research, it was actually the majority of projects over the past 5 or 6 years.
Okay. It would be interesting to know, but regardless, this should be voted out, I think, for public comment. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, David. Ken Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to say that I think it's a good step forward for the MPO. And so my compliments also to staff and to the committee for working through this. I think this is going to be somewhat of an iterative process. As you implement these things, you're going to learn things, and then the process might change. But I think it's important to let proponents know that the MPO is keeping an eye on these things at a very minimum. One point of clarification about the 4%, that is federal highways suggested guidance regarding project inflation. But again, nothing prevents the state or the MPO to provide some information to us to propose a different approach to inflation, whether it's different rates or compounding, or there is an opportunity for the MPO or the state to make some changes to that if they can justify it. And finally, just a suggestion. I think this table, the tiers. I have some of the same kinds of questions I think that David does as to how beneficial it is. But I think it's important not only to think about this in the context of cost changes, but also to the cost of projects at the very beginning. I mean, this is important information, and it's important to know, well, how come this project has a very high cost or a very low for a very low number of points, very low value, basically. And it's important to ask those kinds of questions, not only in the context of cost changes, but generally in the context of programming a project to begin with. And I would also, Matt, if you could go back to the recommendations, I think there was one of the other recommendations, I think it was 6, 7, 8, and 5, 6, 7, and 8 or something like that. I guess you have the recommendation about number, it was something about the, asking for the unit cost or other kind of.
You got to keep going to the very end of the deck. There you go.
Oh, there we go. Right. The first bullet there, I'm sorry. The first bullet there, I would suggest that's an important thing too, because I think your project scoring, I mean, it's a valuable exercise, but again, it's unrelated very often to the size of the project. And so I think you would find that low scoring, your projects that are smaller would have a higher cost benefit than projects that are larger, perhaps. I think you would find that and as you plotted things. But I think it would be a suggestion. I would ask MPO to ask staff to pick a project type, whether it's bike ped or complete streets, and come up with some suggested unit cost metrics or cost effect metrics that we would ask proponents to provide, just as sort of a pilot to see what these kinds of things look like. Because I think that information would be very helpful. So I think that would be useful to ask staff, come up with some suggestions to ask proponents to provide regarding unit cost. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ken. Jen Constable.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I too want to thank the committee for the work. The information that was reported back was both clear and insightful. I have two questions, and one is around the recommendation of continuing the practice for allocating all available TIP funds. One of the reasons we got to this point was essentially more need than we had funding. And what we know is that there are going to be cost overruns. So does it make sense? Was there discussion about whether or not or why it might not make sense to have a certain set aside year over year in anticipation of those cost overruns? And that, could be a flexible amount or it could be a set amount based on information received each year, which leads me to my second more comment, I suppose. I think that having the status reports or this biannual reporting is smart, and it's not an uncommon practice, but that the information that's sought from each of the projects is standard so that that staff and the MPO are getting consistent information relative to the status of the project and in anticipation of knowing what cost increases there may be. So that, so the information is standard, but that it's also reported back to the MPO in some condensed status report, so that we're able to follow what's happening with projects out in the street as well.
Hey, I see you got your hand up. Do you want to answer something that Jen said before we go to the next comment?
Yeah, I can reply to her first sort of question about reserving some amount of the TIP target funds. So we did have a discussion about that, and one of the challenges or sort of one of the tensions with the MPO process and the MassDOT design process is that given just the staff constraints to be able to review projects and advance them, that MassDOT is not, is really only is able to focus its most attention on projects that are programmed in the TIP. So if a project is not programmed in the TIP, it does not get a lot of attention to advance it. And so there's a feeling that we want to make sure that we are programming projects and not being overly conservative about reserving funds and not programming projects, because we do want to get projects into the pipeline and we want to get them onto the TIP and reviewed. And so the idea that we discussed was implementing these policies first and seeing if this can address a majority of the problem. But then if it doesn't, go back to the compounding, that Len has raised, or reserving funds or something like that. But we thought that we would do these as a first step and see if this over the next, couple cycles addresses the problem.
Okay, thank you. That makes sense. I would think a few years into it, you'd know better what to set aside. So that makes sense. Thank you.
And then I think your second point is a really good one, and we can take that one back about, standardizing what the sort of request information is. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I too want to applaud the committee and the staff for doing such a thorough and thoughtful job on this. I think it's impressive, and I would support putting it out to public comment. I just wanted to go back to one point that I think Daniel made about capacity or staff capacity to implement this, and just want to be sure that we have the capacity to implement it. If it's going to add additional work, that the staff is confident that they're able to take that on.
Yeah, I can maybe speak to a handful of points, this one and some others that have come up. Starting with the staff capacity, I mean, we did have some conversations about this at the committee. And, I think the goal is something like, twice yearly check-ins with proponents or something like that would be to, as Jen noted, very much standardize the process. It could even be something as simple as a Google form or something of like sending something out, getting a quick status update from proponents, like letting us know, where are you? Do you have any issues coming up? Like, are you working on your next design phase? Sort of, just a basic level of check-in to flag any issues. And so, and has been noted throughout this conversation, I mean, all these things can be iterative. So we can sort of, put some practices into place, see how time consuming they are, and then sort of adjust accordingly. But I think, the goal is to just set something that's a little bit more standard than we have now, which is really just based on sort of when issues arise and we, try to address them, or, when we're developing the new tip and we need some basic information from folks. So, so we're certainly conscious of the staff capacity issue. And I think we'll work, as a team, at CTVS to find a way to implement some of this in a way that is, pretty efficient. I think it's the other question I wanted to come back to is just the question about, how many projects would this affect? How many projects have actually been added to the tip at PRC approval versus a 25% design. So this is just based on the current 22 to 20, or the nearly current 22 to 26 tip. But of that selection of projects, 2/3 of those projects were first programmed just at PRC approval. And then sort of furthermore on the cost increase side of things, roughly 2/3 of projects in our sample over the last 10 years have seen cost increases of 25% or more. So I don't know what the exact number is in the overlap on that Venn diagram without going back to the project by project data, which I can certainly do offline. But the upshot of all this is that changing these rules would impact a significant number of projects, and so that's where we hope that the impact to the scale of the cost increase issue is also significant. Obviously, we want to address this in a meaningful way. So I hope those are helpful points.
Thanks, Matt. Daniel Amstutz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I support, sending these recommendations out for, for the public to review over whatever period is necessary and to come back, get some feedback and information. I think, so I agree with my other colleagues, and I prepared to make that motion now if we need to, formally take that action. So I'll make a motion to send it out, but not yet. Okay.
Nope.
Okay. Then let me. Okay. Then let me just ask. The last thing that came to mind right now is when it comes to the sort of timeline of implementing this. So some of these recommendations require a bit more like digging into things underneath. Like we've talked about some of the more of the details. Is that something that would be figured out? Like once this goes out when this goes out for public and then comes back or so on, like what would there be a more specific proposal coming back in like the November or late fall timeframe? Is that the idea?
Yeah, so I think, if these were to go out for public review in the coming days or week, based on those comments, we would come back to the board and share those And then, staff could make any sort of needed updates to the policy, including, fleshing out any details that that the board would like more information on. And then, once those sort of edits and details are fully sort of written out, then staff would ask for the board's endorsement of a final proposal.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? I got a couple. So my first one is just to be sure I know what we're talking about. You have to be at 25% to be in the tip, whether that's year 1 or year 5. Is that correct?
Submittal, 25%.
Yeah, I got 25% submittal. That's correct, right?
That's what we would like to see. And if it seems like the universe of projects, there's not enough that are ready there, then we would be, we'd be able to, make exceptions, but that is what we want to put out is the expectation.
Yep. And then for the short, because we've decided not to apply this rule to projects that are already in the tip. In the short term, that will mean there will be pre-25% projects in years 2, 3, and 4, or 2 and 3, maybe a little bit in 4, because I don't think we really programmed year 5 of this current tip. And then in years 4 and 5, everything will be 25% or better. Right? And I'm not objecting, I'm just making sure I understand what's going on.
Yeah, that would be the hope. Although again, there might be some projects right now that, are in for this next tip cycle that are not quite at the 25% submittal. And we'll just have to, I think we'll have to see what sort of our kind of universe or ballpark of projects are.
Okay. And then my second question, was there any consideration or discussion of a higher threshold in order to advance to year 1 of the tip? Because I know from your graphs that the average increase from 75 to 100, from 25 to 75 is 20%. And so if you program a 25% project in year 1, you are sort of accepting the fact that it might increase by as much as 20%. So was there any discussion of you should be at 75% or better before you're programmed in year 1?
We had some discussion about how Cape Cod does it, Matt. What we talked about, if you're programmed if you're getting programmed in the first year of the tip, you should be at like 75%. We had some discussion about that.
Okay, but you decided not to recommend it.
Yeah, I think the committee's general sense was that going higher than the currently recommended threshold of 25% submittal was just setting too high of a bar to the point that it would be prohibitive for proponents to justify moving forward with that level of design spending without knowing if they had capital funding. And so I think that is one of the main points that we'd like to hear from municipalities in the region about during public comment is if this threshold is the right sort of not too hot, not too cold situation, or if something else would be warranted.
I think we also felt that it's very rare that we program new projects into the first year of the tip, and that we felt that we really, for the first and second year of the tip, we're really relying on MassDOT to provide us with the information and really to determine whether the project would be ready or not.
Okay, and John Bouchard, I think you have a comment on that question before I ask my final question and we take our vote to release this. Go ahead, John.
Yes, thank you, David. David, I did participate in as many of these meetings as I could to try and address questions and discuss process and policy on our part. And the committee really was focusing on the longer term vision of projects being listed and didn't although we discussed, listing a project in the first year should achieve, 75% or higher. The focus was on the longer view than as Eric just stated, it's not very prevalent that we have projects come in at the very end and trying to get listed in year 1 because of some priority, and we usually assess that on a case-by-case basis. So it wasn't my recollection that we offered it into the recommendations because it was infrequent and something we could address more on the fly.
Okay, thanks, guys. Last question. Can you put your graph up again? So if I'm reading this correct, it's impossible for a project to fall out of tier 2, regardless of cost, if it scores above 50. Is that true? Right? That line just goes to infinity, and you could be a 50 and cost $1 million per point, but you'll never fall into tier 3. Is that correct?
I believe that's correct, yes.
Okay. Daniel Amstutz, do you want to make the motion to release this? Or unless there's any more comment? Can you unmute Daniel so he can make the motion? I cut him off on earlier.
Yes, happy to make that motion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel. Is there a second? Eric, you want to second it?
I will second that motion. Thank you.
You're welcome. Please call the roll, Jonathan.
David Moeller,
Yes.
John Bouchard,
John Bouchard, yes.
John Romano,
John Romano, yes.
Jillian Linnell,
Jillian Linnell, yes.
Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Myra Patterson, taking over for Brian Kane,
Amira Patterson, representing Brian Kane, we vote yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Bill Conroy,
Yes.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Jim Fitzgerald, yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz,
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Todd Corain,
Todd Green, yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Bent, yes.
Patrick Keyser,
Patrick Keyser votes yes.
Darlene Nguyen,
Darlene Nguyen votes yes.
Tina Cassidy,
Tina Cassidy votes yes.
Jennifer Constable,
Jennifer Constable, yes.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Motion carries unanimous, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Jonathan. Excellent work by everybody. Congratulations. Next item on the agenda is the exploration of uncertainties related to the pandemic and post-pandemic travel behaviors. I believe Rebecca Morgan is going to go first. Is that right?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. And good morning, everyone. I am Rebecca Morgan, and I serve as the Director of Project Partnerships at CTPS. And the focus of my role is on developing the partnership relationships, as well as providing strategic direction around our project delivery, as well as the application of our products and tools. This morning, I'll be presenting with Marty Milkovich, my colleague, who is the Director of Modeling and Analytics. And his primary focus right now is on the design and development of our new travel demand modeling tools. We will be presenting on a project that we are undertaking on the exploration of uncertainties related to the pandemic and post-pandemic travel behaviors. Before I get into specifics on our plan for the project, I'd like to set a bit of context for this work. You may have read the Future Work Report that came out this summer from the governor's office. And I think a statement in that report really framed this issue around the potential change in travel behavior very well. It states that changing ways of working, such as hybrid and remote work, may shift the center of gravity away from the urban core. This potential shift will possibly change travel behavior. For example, we may see an increase in shorter trips and thereby more local traffic potentially. In addition to the Future Work Report, the Boston Globe also published a survey which was of 1,000 Kendall Square employees who were asked about their plans for the future of their work. And of those surveyed, 92% expressed a strong desire for staggered or flexible schedules, and 79% anticipate working from home at least a few days a week. And so we know that there's this potential from work from home, but we're not really sure how that may change travel behavior. And so that's what we would like to look at as part of this study. And lastly, in terms of context, we receive this question from our stakeholders quite frequently, where we're being asked, how are you adjusting forecasts to address the pandemic and post-pandemic impacts on travel? We understand that we're not the only group that's looking into this issue. We know we have partners and other public agencies that are exploring this as well, including Mass DOT and OPMI, for example. But our focus for this specifically is around our tools and how these uncertainties may impact and affect our model results. For example, growth rates or transit ridership or emissions. And so that's kind of the focus of this study for us. The project is going to be a joint effort between the Boston Region MPO and Mass DOT. It's being funded by both agencies, and we're working very closely together on exploring these uncertainties. And we see this as being something that will be very, very valuable to all the stakeholders within our region. We are expecting a number of public agencies to be a part of this process, including Mass DOT Office of Transportation Planning, MAPC, including Eric Barassa, who I know has expressed interest, the MBTA, Mass DOT OPMI, who does the data management and performance management for both the T as well as Mass DOT, as well as Massport and the Boston Region MPO. We also expect others beyond the public sector who would be interested in this topic and may be part of some of the meetings, including universities, advocacy groups, and consultants. The kind of idea here is really bringing together a variety of stakeholders that have different interests and expectations and priorities to really provide input into our understanding of how these uncertainties may impact our model outputs and tools. The purpose of this project is to provide consistent, reasonable, and useful guidance to MPO stakeholders to leverage CTPS's products in light of pandemic and post-pandemic uncertainties. And this work is being done in parallel with the design and development of our new travel demand modeling tools. And the expectation is that in these meetings, this input will really provide direction into that design and development around post-pandemic scenario planning. The project scope is really going to be a focus on stakeholder engagement, stakeholder meetings, where we look to identify and define potential long-term impacts, as well as describing how those impacts challenge our existing model inputs and assumptions. And from there, we'll do two things. We'll develop a guidelines around how our model outputs should be utilized and interpreted, as well as a roadmap for future research in this area. We have two desired outcomes. One is stakeholder input and buy-in on how to interpret and utilize the outputs of our travel demand modeling tools in a post-pandemic scenario, as well as recommendations for new data and tools to help improve how we estimate future demand and explore uncertainties moving forward. I'm now going to pass the presentation over to Marty Milkovits, who is going to speak more specifically about our modeling tools, as well as give an example of work from home behavior.
Thanks, Rebecca. So as Rebecca's just described, the process and our approach is really first focused on understanding our stakeholder needs, the consumers of the travel estimates that CTPS provides, and to see how those needs have evolved due to our changing assumptions and expectations on travel behavior, particularly in the post-pandemic timeframe. And this is directly connected and comes right back to the model, which is my area of interest and attention. Because if you were in the April meeting when I first presented on modeling fundamentals and futures, I described the model using this flow chart and really breaking it down, simplifying it to it's a set of inputs, defining our scenarios. It's a set of assumptions or theory that are based on observations, but essentially define how those inputs are interacted. And then we run through a platform, we get results, and that's great, but it's only really useful if there's a stakeholder with a need that need is met from insights that are provided through this modeling process. So what we're recognizing here is that stakeholder needs have evolved, particularly because of the pandemic. This is something that's always happening. So we really want to structure these conversations to help us see how those needs are evolving and the concerns, and trace that back with our stakeholders to see, okay, what inputs, what assumptions should we be reconsidering? What are the ranges of uncertainty that we have around them? And so the timing of this is particularly key because we are designing and developing the travel demand model that will support the 2023 LRTP. We're going to call this model Travel Demand Model for 2023, or TDM 23. So that model is set up to be built by the end of this calendar year. Then we'll start validating it. But we're also going to be using it for the scenario planning to support the LRTP. And so that's something, exploratory scenario planning, something you're going to be hearing more about later on from many people from CTPS. So this scenario planning exercise will also inform how we should use the model with these exploratory capabilities around changing and work from home behavior. And that is going to be the basis, the model and this understanding of the practice for future project work and data requests and meeting those stakeholder needs. So here, kind of to ground people a little bit more in, what would this conversation actually cover? So of course, one of the major changes in post-pandemic travel behavior is the work from home aspect of it. So putting this in the context of a travel demand model, when we're thinking about the inputs and the assumptions, we can start to think about, okay, remote work, maybe we can group this by industry and what kinds of jobs might be more or less remote and be able to be served in a remote fashion. Worker income groups, are higher income workers more likely to be able to work remote, or even area type. People that are living downtown, working downtown, less likely to actually work remotely versus someone who's relocated further out. And then the model gives us this great platform to tie those changing expectations to the implications on those metrics. I want to give a quick shout out in kind of how we're framing this to Connor Gately at MAPC, who's going to be presenting on his research into the trends of working from home on October 6th as part of the Future of Work webinar. So his analysis is actually helping us really think about how we want to structure what can be a work from home component in our travel demand model, and we're going to be basing it on that. So the other aspect of this work, Rebecca, if we go to the next slide, is exploratory modeling. And so this is something that we're really excited to discuss with our stakeholders, and the potential to use techniques that aren't just giving you a single point prediction with a single assumption on where each of these things will fall, but rather looking at a range, which is something that's a lot more useful when you're dealing with deep uncertainty, such as post-pandemic travel behavior. So these two plots that I'm showing here are actually outputs from the existing travel demand model, or a development version of the travel demand model, with FHWA's exploratory modeling analysis tool called TMIP-EMAT. So what we're seeing here is a scatter plot, the results of thousands of model runs, equivalent of thousands of model runs, rather than that single point. And so you might say, well, what is this really telling me? So we just have generic labels on that. But let's say output X is AM BMT on the Mass Pike east of 95 coming into Boston. So we want to know how that AM BMT might change with, say, changing levels of work. We'll call that input A, but also maybe the changing shift in land use. People are actually moving further out of town, and as well as jobs relocating further out of town, and a shift from that center of gravity from the CBD to somewhere a little bit west. So if input A is that relationship of the total work from home behavior, input B was the shift, you can see that there's a much stronger response in input A to that AM BMT, right? As that goes, it's got a really tight correlation. There is some correlation there with input B, you can kind of see the shift, but the range across it is also quite broad. So with this example, you can kind of start to get that insight of what areas of uncertainty are going to be making a bigger or lesser impact on the metric of interest. So I hope that people are finding it interesting. We really important to have the stakeholders, as I mentioned, that stakeholders make the model a useful tool. But I'm going to pass it back to Rebecca to talk about the next steps.
Thank you, Marty. For next steps, we are in the process of putting together materials, including topics and questions that we plan to explore. And we also are looking to reach out to a number of stakeholders to start scheduling meetings for the October and November timeframe. So if you are interested in being part of this process or being included in stakeholder meetings, or you're interested in just seeing the results of this project, please do reach out to Marty Milkovits or me. We would definitely would like to hear from you and are looking forward to your input. Thank you very much. And I think we have some time for questions.
Thanks. Any questions from the members? Seeing none, I guess silence is concurrence. Go for, Bill Conroy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Rebecca, for taking on this huge task. There's so many uncertainties. I think I spoke about this at a prior MPO meeting. So we, the city of Boston, would like to be a strong participant in this going forward. And I may have some members of my staff here that would be really helpful in this as well. So I want to thank you for taking this on and look forward to the upcoming meetings. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. Other questions or comments? Seeing none, please do get in touch with Rebecca and or Marty to let them know of your interest, as I'm sure many of you are interested. Thanks, guys. Next item on the agenda is the MPO election survey. Rosine Foley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, board members and members of the public. My name is Roisin Foley, and I am the Administrative and Communications Associate on the Certification Activities and MPO Support Team at MPO staff. Next slide, please. So at the MPO meeting on August 5th, I presented the results of a survey that we conducted between January and May of 2021. The goal of this survey was to gauge familiarity with and opinions about the MPO municipal elections process among the 97 cities and towns in the MPO region. These are the municipalities who are eligible to stand for election to the board and to vote in the annual elections. During the discussion after that presentation, members requested some follow-up tasks to better understand the data, namely that we stratify the data set to show any contrast between responses from MPO board member municipalities and responses from non-MPO board member municipalities. So today I'm back to present that data. The stratified results of the survey, including paraphrase responses to open answer questions, are posted to the MPO meeting calendar. I'd like to thank Kane Kim for all her hard work cleaning and formatting the data. So today I'll briefly review why we did the survey, current elections procedures, and how we went about survey design, communications, and outreach. Then I'll present some key results and takeaways and send it over to the vice chair to open it up for questions and discussion. The overall goal of the presentation is for you, the board, to decide what, if any, structural changes you would like to make to the elections process. Next slide, please. So to review, why did we do this survey? Every 4 years, our federal partners review the MPO's activities and issue a report that includes both commendations and recommendations for improvement. The last report was published in 2019, and in it, our federal partners recommended that the MPO review voting procedures for board seats to ensure that they effectively engage all communities in the region and results in effective representation. So this survey was a response to that recommendation. Next slide, please. So before getting into the survey, it's helpful to review what those current election procedures are. Currently, MAPC and the MBTA Advisory Board jointly administer the annual elections. The MPO has 12 elected municipal members. 4 seats are at large, 2 for towns and 2 for cities. There are 8 seats that represent each of the 8 MAPC subregions, and these can be held by cities or towns. Terms are for 3 years, and each fall, 4 of the 12 seats are up for election. Chief elected officials of the municipalities in the region are those folks who vote. And generally speaking, about half of the chief elected officials in the region regularly vote in the elections, which are held at MAPC's fall council meeting. In the last 21 years, 17% of the 97 eligible municipalities in the MPO region have held seats on the board. 7 municipalities have run, but have never been elected. So that's the current process that we're working with and that our federal partners asked us to take a look at. Next slide, please. So our key questions were guided by the federal recommendation. Are we engaging all communities in the region, and is that engagement resulting in effective representation? Next slide, please. So as the entities that oversee the elections process, MAPC represented by Eric Barassa and MBT Advisory Board represented by Brian Kane presented an initial proposal for a survey in May of 2020. The MPO discussed that proposal and directed Eric and Brian to work with us at MPO staff on revising the survey questions and issuing the survey. Given the demands of the pandemic on municipal capacity, we waited to launch until this year. We sent out communications via our mailing list, MAPC and MBT Advisory Board mailing lists, and we also conducted targeted outreach to known contacts in MPO municipalities that had not yet participated. Next slide, please. So moving on to the main event, which is results. It's likely that the increased demands of the pandemic on municipal staff was still a factor in response rate, but we were able to get 90 responses from 55 municipalities, or 56% of municipalities in the region. One response came from a municipality outside the region, Stoughton. We decided not to discard this response because Stoughton was previously in our region and has since left. So we felt that their perspective might be useful. So their response is in the data set, but it's not on the map here. So for this further exercise in stratifying the data, 3 responses that did not indicate a municipality were removed. Most municipalities responded once, but we did receive multiple responses from some, which are indicated by the increasingly darker shading on the map. Responses from the town of Scituate were reduced from 11 to 5. This was at the request of board members to reduce the influence of one municipality's responses on the overall data set. So this reduced the overall responses to 82 from 90. Responses from MPO board member municipalities represent 27% of the overall data. So one thing that is important to note is that responses from MPO board member municipalities did not necessarily come from the actual MPO board representative or other staff familiar with the MPO. So as you'll see, responses still indicate a range of familiarity with and opinions about the MPO. Next slide, please. So if you can remember from back in August, the highest number of responses in the aggregate came from those who identified themselves as planning or Department of Public Works staff. And we had identified this as a possible key disconnect for the elections process, since our primary contacts are with planning and DPW, but chief elected officials vote and run for board seats. Internal communication within municipalities may not be in a place where all parties are on the same page about their relationships to the MPO process. This interpretation seems to be supported by the stratified data, with slightly more responses from non-MPO board members coming from electeds. But overall, for both sets of data, the majority of responses still came from planning and DPW staff. Next slide, please. In my first presentation, the main ways respondents reported interacting with the MPO were TIP related, either submitting projects or having projects currently programmed. This makes sense since, like I said, folks within planning and DPW who know the MPO and are involved in project design are not the same folks responsible for participating in the elections process. This was largely the same for the stratified data, except that it obviously is skewed by the massive difference between hold/held a municipal seat on the MPO board. It is interesting to know, however, that not all of the MPO board member municipalities chose that option. which indicates that not everyone within a certain municipality is necessarily aware of their city or town's role at the MPO. Next slide, please. Similarly, the stratified results did not reveal a large difference in awareness of the MPO between the two groups. Next slide, please. But they did reveal a larger difference in terms of familiarity, with more MPO board member municipalities saying they were very familiar. Next slide, please. MPO board members were also more familiar with voting and running for seats, obviously, but it was not an across the board very familiar either. Next slide, please. And the next slide, please. So only non-MPO board members answered this question about not voting, although some member municipality responses did say they weren't sure if they had voted. So this chart is the same as in my first presentation, with a lack of familiarity and information about the elections being key in terms of reasons for not voting. Next slide, please. Top reasons for not running included a lack of staff capacity, a lack of information, and a feeling that the current sub-regional reps do a good job representing their interests. Next slide, please. So as I discussed in my first presentation, a lack of information and knowledge about the MPO seemed to be a general theme throughout the responses. And in the stratified data, this was only more pronounced for non-MPO board member municipalities. Those that did receive information largely received it directly from a combo of our comms channels and MMPC channels. Next slide, please. So interestingly, while respondents overall seemed unwilling to indicate that they feel the process is unfair or not transparent, more MPO member municipalities indicated that it was fair and transparent, and more MPO member municipalities indicated that it was fair and transparent. The only response that outright indicated that it was not was from an MPO board member municipality. Non-members were more likely to say they didn't know, which aligns with a lack of familiarity with the process overall. Next slide, please. So in terms of possible solutions, you'll remember that we asked both what respondents felt the biggest challenges to running are and what the best solutions would be. In the overall data, by far the biggest challenge in the aggregate was time commitment, with 66% saying serving on the board and traveling into Boston for board meetings are time consuming. This remained largely the same for the stratified data, although more non-members said that they were unsure or that challenging incumbents is uncomfortable. Taken with open answer responses regarding the improved inclusivity of virtual meetings, it probably remains a good idea for the MPO to consider its long-term virtual meeting policy as part and parcel of the attractiveness of running for the MPO, as well as for making meetings more accessible to the public. Open answer responses to the question, what would it take to encourage more municipalities to seek election from non-members, also clustered around the need for more information, communication, and outreach, and reducing barriers such as the time commitment. Next slide, please. So in terms of possible changes, both board members and non-board member municipalities chose subregions voting for subregional representatives as the top solution, continuing to hold virtual meetings and holding more meetings outside of the state transportation building were the second and third top responses, followed by term limits and at-large reps being voted in by only cities and towns respectively. Next slide, please. So having run through the stratified results, hopefully not too quickly that you couldn't grasp them, the key thematic takeaways are largely the same. Among respondents, there was a general lack of knowledge or awareness of the MPO and its role, and a desire for more communication and outreach on the benefits of engaging with MPO via elections. Time commitments were viewed as a large barrier, and there was a desire to continue virtual meetings to increase access. Open answer responses indicated that some smaller communities may view the MPO as unaware of their specific concerns and may not see the benefit of seeking election or be uncomfortable challenging incumbents. The main splits in terms of the two data sets seem to be in the degree of familiarity and comfort with the current process But there was no overall skew towards MPO members indicating that the current process requires no improvement. It is important to remember that elections are not the only way that municipalities can and do engage with us. The results of this survey are super instructive for helping us as staff understand what we can do better with the resources we have available to engage municipalities in other ways as well. So if you could just go ahead a couple slides. Next, please. There we go. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions folks may have, and I'll send it over to Eric and Brian to lead the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosie. Eric, you want to say anything, and Brian, either one of you, before we start the discussion?
I just want to start by saying, tremendous thanks to Roisin and the other colleagues at CTPS that did this work. Really great work to try to suss through all of the information here. I will say that when it comes to the election process, both Brian and I are really doing more outreach to not just like the mayors or the select board chairs and the town administrators, but really we're casting a wide as net as possible to get information to folks. I think that's one thing we learned through this process. And then I think we discussed this at the last meeting, is just the kind of lack of familiarity with kind of some of the issues or what the MPO does. We want to have a conversation with CTPS about, over the course of the fall and winter, doing more outreach through the subregions and maybe even other channels to just do more of the kind of, this is what the MPO does, and education about that. So I think those are some very near-term follow-ups to this. But yeah, absolutely interested in kind of thoughts, questions about the survey response, and then about the questions that Roisin has here. And Brian, if you want to add anything.
Actually, I think Brian's probably going away, right?
No, he's here.
Sorry, I had to step away for a few moments there. Again, just want to echo Eric's thanks to Roisin and all her colleagues for the great effort and the great work and slicing this thing up again in a different way. I think the results are largely the same. I think municipalities, when they think about the MPO, which is very little, think we're doing a pretty good job. We don't have regionalization as much in this state as in other states. I think we have a very strong staff and a very good team, but interested to hear what the rest of the board has to say about these questions and the other things. And also thanks to Eric for really driving this process forward. And just to back up what he said, we are casting a large net. I sent a blast out actually an hour ago. I'm trying to remind folks that the deadline is coming up. Whenever I'm talking to different groups of transit advocates or any other people, I'm telling them. So, and I would invite everyone to do the same. Let's all get the word out and get as many folks running as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Any comments, questions, MPO members? Ken Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, I want to thank you too, Roisin. I think this is very helpful. I did have a couple of questions. One, was there any outreach to the communities that did not respond at all? Because by my count, there were 11 MPO communities that responded, 43 non-MPO communities responded. So by my count, that means there are 43 communities that did not respond at all.
So during the outreach process, we did do some targeted outreach to folks that we saw had not responded yet. And that did garner us some more responses, but obviously we didn't get everyone. We haven't done anything post survey.
I see, because I think, again, I think this is very useful information. Drawing conclusions, if you think about the lack of familiarity that some people expressed, non-MPO members particularly, and then if you consider the fact that there are 43 communities that didn't respond at all, you may, I'm not sure it would make sense to surmise completely that they're unfamiliar, or they just didn't, either they're unfamiliar or didn't think it was worth their time to respond to a survey, or you didn't get it to the right people perhaps too. That's also a possibility. I think this is very helpful information, and I would urge the MPO to consider some of the suggestions that we have. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. Daniel Amstutz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And yeah, thank you to Roisin and everyone who worked on this. Definitely very helpful. I thought the stratified results were really insightful and interesting. To the, I guess at least the first two bullet points over here about subregions and cities like at large, it seems to make sense to me about subregions voting for subregional representatives, especially if that's sort of a if they're supposed to represent that particular region, it makes sense that there would be sort of an agreement between the subregional communities that who's representing them. That I don't see a particular issue with that. On the second bullet, I seem to recall in the results that didn't really get a whole lot of support regarding cities voting for at-large cities and towns voting for at-large towns. That to me, that doesn't really make a lot of sense. It seems like it makes an unnecessary sort of city-town divide that doesn't need to be there. I think we have just talking about Arlington. We have a couple of cities that are next to us, and I don't see them as being competitors in any way like that. So I think that's sort of a strange thing to propose. And I don't know about term limits, but that's those are things that came to mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Others? Seeing none. Okay, we need to. Oh wait, Ken, you need to speak.
Sorry, Mr. Chair. Just one thing about a question about the voting subregions voting for subregional representatives. That is typically the way it's done in other MPOs around the state. And I would also venture to say that perhaps the forum for the voting, if you went to that, you may be able to have the forum for the voting be at the subregion, maybe at a subregional meeting, as opposed to at the the MAPC annual meeting, which may allow, those are pretty well attended from what I understand, and so shifting the forum for the vote may also be helpful. And just regarding term limits, I know that elected officials generally don't like term limits, but you could consider some kind of a non-strict term limit kind of policy, whereby you would only institute term limits if there was a challenger. If there was no challenger, you would allow you could allow an MPO member to continue serving if they're unchallenged. So there are ways to make some of these things perhaps more palatable. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You're welcome. So we need to answer these questions. So I'm going to ask that Eric and Brian, if you'll do me this honor, can you make a motion to say yes to each of these? And even if you want to vote no afterwards, but we need to get something on the record of whether the MPO wants to do this. So can I get one of you to make the motion that only subregions should vote for subregional representatives, and the second one, the other one can second it. Then we'll have some discussion and vote, because otherwise we're not going to get any result today, and we need to get resolution on this.
I will make the motion that we change our voting procedures such that only the municipalities in each individual subregion will vote for that subregional representative.
Thank you. There's a motion and a second. Is there discussion? Lynn Diggin.
Sure. So I will go ahead and support it. The only reason I didn't mention it again was that when I brought it up last time, I think Tom Allenough said effectively, that's what we have is because we apparently subregions kind of put up one person, or they amongst themselves decide who is going to run. So because of that, we effectively have sub-region president voting for sub-regional representatives, but to formalize the process is fine with me, so I'll support it.
Thank you. Other comments? Seeing none, Jonathan, call the roll. Oh, wait, that's your Keiser.
Yeah, sorry for the late hand. Just a follow-on comment in regard to the subregions and in the, I forget if it's called North Central MPO or want to choose it. But anyways, that part of Massachusetts that I participated in, it was a sub-regional gathering. It may sound a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but it's actually works is by having the subregions meet to make the decision. It starts where it's maybe lacking to create some regional relationships for the communities to gather and talk about these issues that are MPO issues. And I think that would be helpful. And the other part was when we did have those gatherings to vote, we were fed by the MPO, and people actually show up to those meetings and participate if you feed them. So that's probably I would give as a recommendation as part of that process.
Thank you, Patrick. Other comments on this before we vote? Seeing none. Oh, Steve Olenoff.
Yes. So even though this is effectively the way it is happening right now, I don't really see that this increases participation. It overall just decreases it because more people are voting. I don't see this as an improvement, and I kind of think it may just be, well, less people are voting for less offices. It just might be decreasing overall participation. So I don't think this is a good idea. I don't think it really achieves anything, and it may even be detrimental.
Thanks, Steve. Other comments? Seeing none, please call the roll.
David Moeller,
Yes.
John Bouchard, John Romano,
Yes.
Jillian Linnell,
Yes.
Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Brian Kane,
Brian Kane, yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Bill Conroy,
Yes.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Jim Fitzgerald, yes.
Jay Monty,
Yes.
David Kozis,
David Kosis, no.
sorry, did you say no?
He said no.
Okay, thank you. Daniel Amstutz,
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Todd Corain,
Todd Corain, yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Bent, yes.
Patrick Keiser,
Patrick Keyes votes yes.
Darlene Nguyen,
Darlene Nguyen votes yes.
Tina Cassidy, Jennifer Constable,
Jennifer Constable, no.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Motion carries, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Wait a minute, go back. We got two other things we got to decide. Let's take term limits first, because I think it's going to be an easy vote. So Eric, can you make a motion on term limits and have Brian second it, or vice versa? Unless nobody wants to make a motion on term limits.
I will make a motion to, how should I put this motion? I'll make a motion that that there will be term limits, that we will develop term limits for the elected municipal seats, the exact detail, well, see, David, this is the challenge with this motion, is I don't know what the term limits are. And
Right.
I just don't know what the,
Right.
I don't know what to say.
Right, but so I think that's fine, because I'm fairly confident that there's, we probably don't have to take a vote on this. I'm fairly confident there's very little to no support for term limits. And to your point, I guess people really can't vote unless they know. So let's skip the term limits one, okay? We will just, unless somebody wants to make a motion to define term limits, we won't take that one up, and we will assume that that's a discussion for another day or never again, as the case may be.
Yeah, I agree. I would prefer, if people feel strongly about term limits, to speak up and say, this is how we would like to structure it, or this is how it could work.
Okay, so can I get a motion on cities voting for cities and towns voting for towns, so we can discuss that and see where the,
Yes, I can make that motion. I'll make a motion that we change the voting procedures such that the at-large, that cities only vote for the at-large city seats, the 2 seats, and that towns only vote for the at-large town seats.
thank you. Is there a second? Brian King.
Second.
Thank you. Discussion, please. David Kozis.
Thank you. You know, as an at-large city, I really definitely don't feel that Newton represents only cities and not towns. You know, we represent the whole region, and I just don't see any advantage to cities only voting for cities and towns, you know, voting only for towns. It just feels like it's an unnecessary complication in the process.
Thank you. Jay Monty.
Yeah, I agree with David on this one. I think, you know, there's definitely still a geographic component to these seats as well. So to this point, I mean, David certainly represents not only Newton, but the surrounding communities. And likewise, we in Everett, we do our best to represent our neighbors in Chelsea and Medford and Malden. You know, I think I don't really see a reason to change this.
Jen Constable.
Thank you. Yeah, I am actually not supportive of this. Similarly, to the reason I voted no on the sub-regional reps being voted in by the sub-region itself. I agree with David and Jay. A lot of our work is not, it's inter-regional. And so for that reason, I'm a no.
Tom Bith.
Again, I agree with David, Jay, and Jen on this, and would be voting no.
Others? Brian Kane, did you have your hand up? Brian?
Yeah, even though I seconded this, I will vote no. I guess I just worry, or my question would be, what about the city of the town of Watertown and the city of the town of Weymouth? How would they vote? No, never mind. Let's vote this down and get this over with.
Okay, any other comments? Seeing none, Jonathan, please call the roll.
David Muller,
No.
John Bouchard. The way he's gone. John Romano,
John Romano, no.
Jillian Linnell,
Jillian Linnell, no.
Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, no.
Leonard Diggins,
Oh,
Bill Conroy.
Jonathan, you're off your game today, man.
No.
Bill Conroy,
No.
Jim Fitzgerald,
No.
I know the answer. All right, Jay Monty, but I have to call it.
No.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, no.
Daniel Amstutz,
Daniel Amstutz, no.
Todd Corain,
Todd Corain, no.
Tom Bent,
Tom Bent, no.
Patrick Keyser,
Patrick Keyser votes no.
Darlene Nguyen,
Arlene Nguyen votes no.
Dean Cassidy has left. Jennifer Constable,
Jennifer Constable, no.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, no.
Motion unanimous, no.
All right, so the end result of all of this excellent work is this for the, Eric, can you tell me, is this for the upcoming election, or is this going to be implemented for the next election cycle that only sub-regions will vote for sub-regional representatives?
We could implement it for this round, although we did not, when I posted all the materials, it indicated the previous policy. So it might be best to just stick to that, because otherwise I will have to send new materials out and everything like that.
I would agree. So unless there's any objection from the members, we're going to assume that our vote to change the sub-regional representative voting structure is not for the election that we've already started the process on, but it's for the next election. Is that okay with everybody? If you object, raise your hand. Seeing no objections, thank you all very much. And Brian and Eric, thank you for making motions even on things you didn't support. We needed to get done. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Next item is member items. Are there any? Seeing and hearing none. Jonathan, when's our next meeting? Is it 2 weeks?
Yes, our next meeting is scheduled for October 7th.
Excellent. Can I get a motion in a second to adjourn? And please state your name for the record, Brian Kane.
Brian Kane moves to adjourn.
Leonard Diggins.
Second.
Without objection, we are adjourned. Thank you all very much. Take care, everybody. See you in 2 weeks.